Good morning and welcome. I'm Matt Chingos. I direct the education policy program at the Institute, Urban Institute. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for what I think will be a very stimulating panel discussion on school funding. I especially want to thank you for your patience with the last minute change of venue, and glad that you all made it here and aren't wandering around over in the West End. I encourage all of you to share your thoughts and observations on social media today using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Feel free to include the speaker's Twitter handles, which are displayed on the agenda today. I also want to welcome our virtual audience. Thanks for tuning in, and of course, you all should feel free to tweet as well. At the Urban Institute, we strongly equalization work. Today is your lucky day. You'll really like these animations. If not, then too bad. But the goal of today's event is not so much to get into these little details of the mathematics of school funding formulas, but to take a much broader look at school funding. And I think that the wide range of perspectives represented on our panel are going to produce a stimulating and fascinating discussion. So leading the discussion today will be our moderator, Matt Barnum. Matt is the first ever national reporter for Chalkbeat and previously wrote for the 74. In addition to having a terrific first name, best first name, Matt understands education research better than most journalists and perhaps even better than the average researcher. So I'm thrilled he's here today to moderate today's discussion. So with that, I'll turn it over to Matt to introduce the panelists and kick off the discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Matt, and likewise about the name. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to see all of you here and our live stream folks joining us, and I'm excited for a great panel and lively discussion. Also, we will have time for questions at the end and maybe in the middle, so please give some thought to questions. Let me introduce our great panelists. First, right next to me, we have Ari Amerikaner, who is the Director of Resource Equity at the Education Trust and who formerly worked at the U.S. Department of Education. Next, we have Marguerite Rosa, who is the Director of the Edunomics Lab and Research Professor at Georgetown University. And then lastly, we have Dan Thatcher, who works at the National Conference of State Legislatures and has tracked education finance policy there for over 10 years. So we have a great panel. I'm really excited to dive in, land on some areas of agreement, hopefully get some areas of disagreement, my favorite part as a moderator. Let me start with a question that Matt said was tired, which was, does money matter? And I would just say that if you look at state legislatures around the country, some of them are still debating the question of does money matter? And this panel, I don't want us to get too hung up on it. But we have seen several studies over the last several years looking at that question specifically. So let me put the question to all of you. Does money matter, and when does it matter the most, or when is it most likely to matter? So let's just start with you, Ari, and then go down.
Sure. Thanks, Matt and Matt, for having us. It's fun to be here. Yes, money matters, and it's not a silver bullet, but it matters, and it matters a lot more for students with higher need. So in particular, it matters a lot more for students living in poverty, and it matters a lot more. We are now seeing new evidence in the last couple of years showing that it matters a lot more when it is long-term. Short one-time infusions of cash are less helpful than long-term steady increases that districts can count on for their budgets over the long term. So we've seen that when you get long-term investments that increase spending by a noticeable amount, 10% or so, over 10, 12 years, an entire decade, entire tenure of a student in public education, it matters, and it can do real things to close gaps for low-income students. It can increase their graduation rates and their number of years completed by a lot, by enough to close gaps in half or even more sometimes. It is certainly not a silver bullet. It has to be used well, but to me, that's why these conversations about money should always be focused on equity, because one, it's just fairness, but two, research shows that money matters a whole lot more for students who need more.
Great. Marguerite?
So I take issue with the question.
I know. I was worried someone would.
Because I don't think it's a yes or no. I think so. Maybe it was a yes or no. I mean, obviously, without any money, we would not have any schools. So that's sort of pointless. But the more relevant question is how much of the variation in outcomes does spending explain? And so whether or not you have any effect at all is whether or not we have a strong effect, or whether or not we could have a strong effect if something were to change. And frustratingly, the amount of money spent on a school doesn't explain as much variation as we would like it to explain. If you ask the question, true or false, do two schools with the same amount of money and roughly the same mix of kids, will they for sure get the same outcomes? The answer is no. We often see two schools with the same amount of money and roughly the same mix of kids getting different outcomes. It's also true that if two schools have the same amount of money, about the same mix of kids, and even spend their money in the same way, we still often see different outcomes. And so there's a lot of other stuff going on. And the question is, how can we make money matter more? So, and I think we have to have that conversation, not only the does money matter conversation, because if we don't have that conversation, we're not addressing a very real concern of many in legislatures who are saying, if you don't want to have a conversation about how we can make money matter more, then I'm not willing to give you more money. And I think that's the part of the question that is sort of more relevant going forward.
And what do you make of the recent studies that have come out? I'm thinking especially like Caribou Jackson's work on school funding litigation and what happens when money gets to districts. And I think it was Diane Whitmore-Schanzenbach work and Jesse Rothstein's work that showed that all things equal, money has made a substantial difference.
Every one of those studies ends, when you go read the conclusion, with, yes, it's true that we need to make sure that money matters more. So they say it's not, like what you're saying, it's not a silver bullet, it's not sufficient by itself, and more work needs to be done to ensure a better relationship between spending and outcomes.
Gotcha.
And so that's where I think we hopefully have landed.
So there's sort of agreement on that point. Dan, is there anything you wanted to add on this question?
I come from the legislative perspective, and it's not, they don't ask that particular question. They can't. They're constrained by their own budgets and the revenues that they have available to them. What they're interested in is if there's research showing if there's a right level, per pupil level of expenditure that they need. And I was at one meeting. Well, one of the things we do a lot at NCSL is bring together legislators around the country and connect them with researchers. In one meeting we had at the chairs of education committees, and the chairs of education committees are really the ones that set the agenda for education policy in their states. And at this meeting, one of the legislators asked a researcher, what's the right amount of money for school? And the researcher said, whatever you have. And that researcher was
That was good.
Surprise twist.
Yeah, and that's really they're constrained by their own budgets and their own resources. And so that's why they're very interested in making sure that money does matter. Where it's not so much does it matter, it's making it matter where they have it.
So let's turn to trying to make money matter. And I suspect, but tell me if there's disagreement here, that most people, all of you on this panel, would agree that more money should go to disadvantaged kids, for kids who need more supports in schools. How do you make that happen, broadly speaking? What sort of systems can states and districts put in place to try to ensure that money gets to the kids who need it most? So first, just let me know if you agree with the premise of the question, and then second, can answer the second part. We'll start with you again, Ari.
Am I gonna have to go first every time?
Yes.
That's so unfair. Okay, so I guess I certainly don't disagree with your assumption that everybody on the panel,
Yeah.
I assume, but we will hear from them, thinks
Yeah.
that more money should go to students who have higher needs, particularly students living in poverty.
And that doesn't happen in many states, just to be clear. Sorry,
It happens in, well, it depends on how you measure it,
Right,
but there are
yes.
certainly some states where districts with higher poverty do get more funding, other states that,
Right.
that don't, based on kind of a lot of different analyses,
Right.
Matt's,
Yep.
ours at EdTrust.
Yep.
But I think that what is maybe important to say here, and what I will use my moment to say, is that I think that most people, if you sort of polled the general public, might agree, but I think there is we are chock full of history showing that people don't actually agree when it comes to action, right? Like the pushback historically about actually trying to give more money to schools that need more, who have higher needs, is just incredible. And so to say we all agree is one thing, but to actually expect action based on that or policies based on that is another thing. And that's why I think, like, I get it. I'm a new mom, right? I have like this 10-month-old baby at home. I totally understand the instinct to do whatever you can to help that kid and to like move to the neighborhood that can get you the best school, or move to the, go in and like fight for the better 4th grade teacher.
Right.
But that is like exactly why it shouldn't matter what I do as a parent to come in and advocate. That's why we need systems to ensure and policies to ensure that more resources are going to schools with higher needs, regardless of where I send my kid. So I guess I would say, like, we need government. We need policies and practices that actually ensure that happens, and that can be at the state level. We can talk about the details of that. But I think my high-level answer is just like, we need systems and rules, and not to rely on sort of the good of people.
Right. Marguerite?
I think you would be hard-pressed to find somebody who is interested in education finance who disagree with the premise that the higher the needs you have, the more you should have more resources to meet those needs. I think the more relevant question is, how does that money flow? Yeah, I'm going to take issue with every question. How does the money flow? So do we target the money to the kids and then say that, if you live in poverty or lack English proficiency, does more money flow toward you? Or do legislatures decide what programs that you'll have and ensure that that if you're a kid with a specific type of needs, then the money is tagged to a reading coach that gives you more reading, or to a social worker that gives you more supports? And I think that that's maybe the bigger question. So we can tag money to students, or we can tag money to stuff that goes to serve students. And my thinking is that education works more effectively when the money is tagged towards students. I don't know that we know as much as we think we know about the best way to serve students with higher needs. And I'm not sure that the best way to serve students with higher needs in one school is the same way as it is the best way to serve students with higher needs in another, or in one school where they have a different access to sort of labor talent than another, or in one school where they've been experienced at teaching a curriculum for a long time than another. So I think when the money for students with higher needs comes with a whole bunch of prescriptions about how delivery goes, then we may increase some, there's a tendency to want to do that, and I worry that can work at odds with the ultimate goal of getting higher outcomes. So we would sort of suggest that schools, that money be tagged to students with higher needs, make it to the schools where the students are with higher needs, and then we do a really good job of measuring the outcomes to see if it worked.
Is what you just described essentially a weighted student funding system?
Yeah.
Can you just describe that a little more in detail?
Yeah, in that model, or we call it a student-based allocation model, student characteristics are measured, and then money flows based on the characteristics of the students. So if a school has more students who are living in poverty or foster care or other kinds of things that are generally tracked to having higher needs, then there would be higher dollar amounts that go with that mix of students. And then the money gets sort of combined at the school level to figure out the best educational plan to serve them.
Dan, could you speak to the question of like how are state legislators approaching the issue of should more money go to disadvantaged students? And is there increased interest among legislators of doing something like Marguerite just described, a weighted student funding system?
Sure. They are very interested in, largely from an accountability perspective, and knowing that the dollars that they're allocating are going to the students that they ought to go to.
Right.
Which is not happening right now, and there's not really any way to measure or identify whether those funds are going there, unless a district has a student-based allocation system like Denver Public Schools. Matt's paper highlighted the fact that legislators appropriate 70 or direct where funds go, about 70 to 80% of funds that are in the school system, how they get distributed through writing the school funding formulas. And the school funding formulas drops the money at the district level, and that's where the legislators are very concerned. And just really recently, I'm getting many more questions from legislators of how can we know that when these dollars get to the district, they actually end up at the school where the child is at. There's an interesting program in Minnesota that's been on the books, I think for over 6 years now. It's a state level student-based allocation that the student that generates the compensatory aid, the 70% of that state aid goes to the school where that student is, and the school has a council that's made up of the parents and teachers and leadership, and they determine how they're going to spend that money on for that student, and then they have to report at the end of the year how they spent the money and whether there was any improvement in academics or livelihood for the student. I really don't know how that is panning out, but it's one of the few programs that I've been able to identify in statute that would actually kind of gets to that intent to make sure that the money gets to the student and it's actually being spent in a meaningful way on the student.
Did you want to add something?
Well, I just want to complicate the weighted student funding thing just for a second, if that's
Great.
all right with you.
Yep.
I think it is absolutely true that if I were a state legislator, I would be upset if I spent a bunch of time working on a funding formula that was designed to get more money to districts with higher student need, and then I found out that those dollars were, once they got to the district, not actually getting to the schools where those kids go. I think that is what happens in a lot of places, and I think that states should be stopping that, right? They should be writing rules into their funding systems that say that's not allowed.
Right.
It's hard to do for a variety of reasons, but I think it's worth doing. But then I just want to point out that just the fact that a district has a weighted student funding system within the district does not necessarily mean that those dollars are actually getting to the schools that serve the kids that earned them. So this is going to be a little wonky for a second, but in a lot of places, the way they actually implement a weighted student funding formula is they say, yes, school, Matt's school is high poverty, so they earn more money. But then, Matt, your school is lower poverty, and so you earn less money.
Right.
So you have $1 million budget, and this other Matt has a $2 million budget. But then when they,
It's good you chose both the
I know, that
Matts
was-
to do this
that was
example.
really
In
bad,
retrospect,
sorry.
you could have. I mean, there are a lot of
you know,
people. Okay, sorry.
whatever,
Continue.
right. Bear with me. You'd think I don't work with advocates and think about this. So if there's a high poverty $2 million budget and a low poverty $1 million budget, then you hire your teachers, and it turns out that the high poverty school has a lot lower paid teachers,
Right.
they get charged back the average district-wide teacher salary often. And so that means that when Matt has his $2 million budget in his high-need school,
Right.
and he hires a bunch of teachers that are getting paid on average
Right.
$50,000 or $30,000 because they're new teachers. They're then getting charged back against his $2 million. His $2 million is going down based on the district-wide average teacher salary of like $70,000 or $80,000. So it undermines
Right.
the whole intent. There's a lot of reasons for that. It's hard to fix that. There's like weird unintended
So like
consequences. but-
wonky details can undermine the weighted student funding formula, and the weights have to go through the political process, as to the point that you mentioned earlier. Like they have to survive the
that too,
politics of
right?
it.
But it's like at a state level or district level, adopting the policy is one thing, but then you always have to be vigilant and check, looking at the data, are the dollars actually ending up at the schools that your policy was trying to get them to?
And Margarita, I'll go to you in a second. I've seen some weighted student funding formulas where they give extra weight to like gifted and talented
Yeah.
students, which is essentially a regressive way to do the weighted student funding. Marguerite?
So I think what Ari's pointing out is that it's absolutely true that we can say we're spending money in one way and really spend it in another way, and that happens all the time. But I'm very excited, and others on the panel know that I'm excited about this, that ESSA includes a new requirement that spending by school, real spending, be reported starting in 2018-19. And that means we'll know. And right now you can go online and spend the next 3 hours trying to find out how much is really spent at some school that's near your house, Maple Leaf Elementary. I'm not going to say Matt School because that's not a real school.
I'll do it better next time.
Maple Leaf Elementary, and you could finish the day with realizing that you can't find that out right now.
Right.
You could call the district. They can't really tell you because they don't count up the money that way. And you could call the state and everybody else, and those numbers are incredibly elusive. So information is going to be a game changer, and so I think that problem that you're mentioning is going to come out in the open and be part of the conversation.
So we've been focusing on like how you distribute money of the fixed pie. But can we talk about like whether there should be more money in the pot to begin with? There was just, some of you may have seen the report just came out from CBPP, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, I hope I got the name right, showing that in 29 states compared to 2008, as of 2015, somehow the most recent data available, as of 2015, 29 states are spending less than they were on schools than they were in 2008. Should states be trying to spend more? And Dan, maybe I'll start with you. Like, what is the conversation that states are having about this issue? Do they feel they can? Why aren't they? Or in many places, why aren't they?
Well, to start off, the Great Recession really decimated state level funding for schools, and states have been crawling out of that hole since 2008, fiscal year 2009. And the legislators that I work with are finding money where they can to make increases year after year increases, and those increases are growing. At first it was 1.2% over the last fiscal year, then it was 2.2%, and then I think the last figures I saw for fiscal year 2017 was that it was almost a 4%, 3.6 to 4% on average increase in state allocations for K-12 education. Given those increases, though, it's still not enough if you account for inflation to get to the pre-recession spending levels. I think probably when we get to fiscal year 17, or fiscal year 2018, we'll probably get to where we were at, given inflation for fiscal year 2018. The problem that legislators are faced with is that there's really no new revenue around. There's no dollars lying around to increase funding. Meanwhile, there's other budgetary pressures, Medicaid, increased Medicaid spending matches, for instance, for states that have expanded Medicaid. And that is actually eating a little bit more of the pie. So as a total expenditure, K-12 has decreased a little tiny bit in fiscal year 2017. It was 19.6% of total state expenditures. That includes general fund and federal funds and other funds. K-12 is at 19.6%, and now it's at 19.2% of total expenditures. So it actually, the pie decreased a little bit. But in terms of finding more revenue. That's a political question,
Right.
and it's driven by politicians' constituents. And if there's the push for it at the ground level, then the legislators can have the political ability to raise more revenue. But that's a political question, from my perspective,
Right,
at least.
right. Marguerite, do you want to speak to like the substantive question about like whether states, again, we have 50 different states, but whether states should be thinking about trying to raise revenue to spend more on schools?
So just on that one, I make my graduate students notice this too, that those analyses are done after accounting for inflation. So,
Right.
so some people will say, oh my gosh, they're cutting, that means that we're spending less, and it doesn't actually, it doesn't actually mean that, because they've taken into account inflation. So it's sort of assuming everybody got raises
Right.
and everything else.
So we're
The other
spending
thing-
less accounting for inflation.
Yeah, well, and they said about half the states were
Yeah,
spending
29
less.
states, I
And
think.
remember that the state money is one source of the revenue pie. So some of the states that were feeling pressures from Medicaid or from their higher education system were figuring out ways to tap more local money to offset that, because you can't really do that for your higher education system or for Medicaid. So it may not mean that the total amount was less. But I
And
also
this
want
is, and I'm sorry to interrupt for just 1 second. I just want to bring this back to Matt's report, that he points out that was something that local areas did after the Great Recession. They tapped into more local money, but that meant that places that couldn't raise as much local money suffered the most, and those tended to be the higher poverty places that couldn't as easily tap into local money, right?
And it depends on the state,
That's
right?
right.
Because what the state can do is say, I'm expecting you to raise local money, and this is something in the new urban report, and use the state money to level on top.
right.
So it does depend on the
Right.
states. It's a state by state game, because
Sure.
the state money could be spread,
Right.
more strategically. The other thing I want to point out is the reference year is 2008, and 2008. If you want to look at the last 70 years of education finance, 2008 is the peak. It was right before sort of the recession hit states. It was sort of an all-time high for staffing in education. By our measurements, we say there was 127, 128 adults per 1,000 students. That was higher than it was in 2000 or 1990, or higher than it is now. So we've measured kind of from the peak on that one. So I just want to say
Sure.
that if you really do look at the last 30 years, I would say generally speaking, states have made a lot of progress on education. And I think we sometimes forget to take stock of that. We've even made a lot of progress on covering the districts where there are inequities. We don't see school districts with 40 or 50 kids in a classroom before, and broken windows and things like that. We're a lot better off than that original Savage Inequalities paper came out. So I think we let's get a new report that the sky is falling, and I think we've sort of got to take stock on
Gotcha.
that. And so I think states are doing what they can, and in some places will have an appetite to spend more. There's still a lot of variation across states. There are places like Idaho and Nevada that are spending really small dollar amounts per pupil, and other states like New York and Massachusetts, and Washington D.C. that are much, sometimes double the dollar amount. So I think it's a much more nuanced picture than you can say in an average.
I'd love to hear from you in 1 sec. Ari, I'm just going to note that after this, I am going to pause for questions a little early, just so it's not just me talking. So give some thought to your questions, and we'll get started with that. But Ari, do you have any thoughts on the expanding the pie question?
So, I mean, this question is hard. People like to say we spend more per student than like almost all of the countries in the world.
Right.
We aren't getting the returns that other countries are. Why would we throw more good money after bad? Right? Like that is a sort of a line of reason. To me, it's just like, it's easy to say things are getting better, and things are getting better. But it's also like, if you are a parent with a kid who is born into poverty, or is a student of color, going to be a student of color when they get into their public school system, it's not working for you right now. And it's not working for you in a lot of places. And so should we spend more money? Like, absolutely, if that's the only way to get more equitable. And I think politically that's often the only way to get more equitable, because it's hard to take from one and give to another. So to me, the focus is we should be getting our money more, we should be spending more in the schools that aren't serving populations that we know are historically underserved. And if the only way to get there is to expand the whole pie, because that's like the political reality we live in, then we should be spending more.
And a point from Matt's report is that local districts will respond to their school funding, the school funding system in ways that may not necessarily help with equity. And so the point about, redistributing money, it runs into a lot of political challenges when you do that.
That's right. And I think so it's a matter of that's the time when things are changing, when the overall pot is changing, either to get bigger or to get smaller, is when you really have to be thinking about equity changes, right? Because when the pot's getting bigger is when you have a political opportunity to everybody wins, but the high need schools win more. And when pots are shrinking, it's really easy to blink and miss a really regressive change happening where you cut at a flat level across everybody, which turns out to be a really regressive thing to do in a state that has been giving more money to high need schools or districts. So really being keen and tuned into that equity question as the pot shrinks or expands is, I think, the most important thing.
All right, I'm going to pause here for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll call on you. Make sure your question ends with a question mark, no monologues. Also, I'll try not to, I know I haven't been giving you guys love, so I'll try not to totally ignore this side of the room. They don't have any questions anyway, apparently, so we'll start right over there.
Can we get introductions for people?
Yeah, please introduce yourself.
How you doing?
And wait for the microphone.
David Edwards. I lobby low-income families, and I'd like to bring in the question of bringing in private industries. They're the beneficiaries of educated children. Where their roles, where their responsibilities in bringing in infrastructure for programs for children in the school system. And I'd like to make a quick reference, if I may. STEM vision. STEM.
Just make it super brief so we can get to it.
So what is the role of private industry in bringing in nutrition into the public school systems and all school systems? Because they get the nutrition, they get the educated children. They're the ones that benefit. Taxpayers are paying a role, but it's for benefit of private industry. Most people go into private industry when they get their education.
Gotcha.
So let's bring private industry's responsibility in, and I have some examples how I can do that.
So, and I'd love you guys to get a reaction to that question specifically. And can we also just talk about potentially the role of private money in schools in ways that may be helpful, but also to what extent may that actually exacerbate inequity? Does anyone want to speak to that?
Yeah, I will, because I just reached out to a reporter who did a story on this, and it's sort of like this classic story that comes up a couple of times a year where here's a school, they had an auction, they made $100,000 from the auction, and this sort of money is completely distorting spending in public education. And when you actually take that $100,000 and divide it as a percent of the total spending on the school, oftentimes what you're finding is that it's less than 1% of total public spending. And I think what the problem with the story is that it misses the amount of public dollars. So if we really want to tackle inequities, the kind of parents raise money for the crossing guard kind of thing isn't really the big piece. The big piece is the 11 million or the 12 million that's being spent on schools and might be unevenly distributed within a district for some of the reasons that Ari was just mentioning. So our sense is across the country, well under 1% is private money of the spending. And oftentimes it's just a nice dangly thing that we can all get upset about over here while we ignore the fact that we might be spending really, really uneven amounts of the public funds. If we're somewhere around 13,000 a kid in this country, you can do the math, times it by a school with 600 kids, and see what the total spending is, and then see how much the 50,000 or the 75,000 or whatever that gets raised really matters. So I think that if we could stop that private money, somehow we could really address equity, and that's
Gotcha.
a distraction.
Anything else to add on this? Okay. Yeah, right up front. Wait for 1 sec for the mic, and
Thanks.
Introduce yourself.
Thanks. Michael Dannenberg with Education Reform Now, which is a think tank for Democrats for Education Reform. I have 2 questions, briefly. One, Margarita, you mentioned ESSA's requirement for reporting on actual expenditures being a game changer. As I recall, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the Obama stimulus program, also required reporting of actual expenditures. And is that right or wrong? And if it's right or wrong, was it a game changer? My second question is, there's a 500-pound elephant in the room, which is tax reform bill, and I would like to know what the panel thinks the implications are for school finance with respect to both the House and Senate proposals to alter the state and local tax deduction.
Got it. Great. We'll start with you,
Yeah, I'll
Marguerite, on
take
the
the
first
transparency
question.
question. I'll let them do the other one. No problem with that. Anyway, so ARRA had a requirement to send a file to the Department of Ed with the salaries of teachers in each school. That sounds like it would be almost the same thing as the total expenditures per school, but it wasn't for so many reasons. The data were messy. It wasn't an expenditure file, right? It was the sum of the salaries of teachers, and it excluded things like special education, and districts actually had a very hard time with doing that. The data went to the Department of Ed. I just went the other day to try to look it up. Really, no one in a district ever knew it existed. So so what is the requirement is now is total expenditures per student, and as a per pupil amount, something that you can compare across schools, and it must be reported as part of the report cards, the school report cards. So suddenly you'll have spending, you'll have outcomes, all these numbers right next to each other in a public format. The requirement is not you must send your file to the Department of Ed, it is that you must report it publicly. And expenditures it's just a very different number without going into the weeds. I think it is very, very different than the data that were reported before, and I think it will have a big effect. I'm watching states work extremely hard on trying to do this. That other requirement, they sent in a file and moved on. This is like people are assigned to this. There's a lot of activity going on, tons of meetings on it, a big network of 38 states that are working on the new visualization systems for it. So I do think it's a game changer.
You want to take the second question?
Absolutely not, but I do want to say more about this.
Yikes.
Marguerite always says I should not rain on her parade
Yes,
about the
yeah.
transparency and how important it is. So that I won't fully rain on her parade. I think it's a really good parade. I am at
You're like
the parade.
missed on her
Yeah,
parade.
I think that the fiscal transparency is really important. Undoubtedly, this is a huge step in the right direction. But I don't know that it's a game changer for a couple of reasons. One, I think the CRDC is different, but one of the reasons that the per pupil expenditure data that has been being, or not quite expenditure data that has been being reported from districts in the ARA/civil rights data collection over the last several years is often kind of like poo-pooed and said like you can't really use it for anything, is people say the quality is really bad because the quality is coming straight from districts to the feds and there's no state role. And so it's very different quality. There's not a lot of quality control, among other reasons that Marguerite mentioned, which are also very real. So I think one big question here is how good are the data when they get collected by the state? And right now, Marguerite's doing yeoman's work to try to help make sure that the data are collected well in states. But it's a big open question right now: is how well are states going to collect this data and calculate these data, and how there's a lot of really hard and really critical questions being decided right now about how consistent the data will be. Like, will states require all of their districts to report the data in some way that is uniform or that is comparable across districts, at least within their state? And there's a lot of heated feelings about whether that, how uniform they should be. So I think one question about whether it's a game changer is like, will the data actually be usable once they eventually come out by people who want to make equity comparisons? And also, like, guys, like, when in our entire history have people been like, oh my God, there are inequities? Let's fix them entirely. Like, it's helpful for advocates. It does give them fuel for their campaign, but I'm not convinced it's going to be a total game changer.
Gotcha. Anyone want to address the second question?
No, I'm not going to step it up.
No.
But we are having a meeting on it next. NCSL is in a couple of weeks. You should all come to it.
Okay.
I will say that we're concerned about how the public will look at these figures as they're reported out, and the media, how they'll look at these. And I agree that you are doing the yeoman's work. It's important. We're concerned about whether the states report them in a way that's understandable and in
Right.
context, and that they won't be misconstrued. But in terms of a game changer, I've heard it posited too that it's possible this may create a new legal theory if there are inequities within a district. So far, the legal theory to litigate on school finances is equity or adequacy. And they've litigated inequities across school districts, but is it possible that they can now litigate inequities from school to school? I've heard it proposed that might be, the data might be used for that purpose, which would be interesting.
So no one wants to talk about tax reform?
I mean, no.
Okay. I mean, will it make a big difference? We know the federal spending is a small share. Is this likely to matter a lot for schools?
I mean, I am so not an expert on this, but the thing that I read and hear that makes a lot of sense to me is that this is, and Dan, you're probably better equipped to talk about this, is that this is going to stretch budgets because if like the SALT, right, if the state and local tax deduction is eliminated, then like there's going to be more pressure in some states on their ability to raise revenue, and so that seems like it will be a problem for education spending, right? Ability to raise revenue matters a lot at the state and local level, but I can say pretty much no more than that.
Gotcha. Next question. Right back there. Yep.
You.
Blue shirt.
Hi, Luann McNabb with the National Council of Teachers of English. Can you talk about how the push for vouchers and choice is going to impact state funding of K-12 schools?
Great, that's a big question. So yeah, who wants to take that one?
So I don't know that it's going to impact funding for schools. I think I'm not sure that somebody can make the statement that if a state decides to adopt a voucher plan, that the state will spend less on its public schools, particularly if you're talking about in per pupil dollars, right? So it's right. If a school district has been getting, let's say, $13,000 a year per student, and some of the students up and leave and take their money with them to a private school, that the school district will still spend $13,000 a student. It'll have fewer students, so that total dollar amount will be less. But that's true for smaller districts as well. So if a school district has 20,000 students, it generally spends twice as much as a school with 10,000 students, because school districts are.
Can you talk about the question about fixed cost, especially for charters where?
So I think it's the same mechanism as if a student moves to the suburb, right? Or if a student moves out of state, or if birth rates go down.
Right.
Student mobility and enrollment loss has that same effect on districts, regardless of whether or not they're moving to charters or to vouchers or to the suburbs or out of state, or birth rates went down, or the industry collapsed and people left. And that mechanism has been difficult for school districts for decades, long before people were talking about this stuff. And I actually wrote a piece on enrollment declines in districts that had nothing really to do with charters more than a decade ago, and those were districts, many large districts that were just watching their population drop. And that's always hard for districts, because they do a great job of expanding, they don't do a great job of shrinking. And in other industries, labor is not really considered a fixed cost, but in education, it feels like a fixed cost. School districts make commitments to their labor that feel like they're commitments for life through tenure and things like that. And it's hard for them to shrink in the same way other industries shrink and get back to their size. And so we do see school districts in stress when they have enrollment drops and their revenues drop with them. Some school districts are better at it than others. About the worst thing a district can do is pretend it doesn't have a problem with enrollment decline and not make changes until it becomes too late. But you can imagine that, like I said, a school district with 20,000 students spends generally about the same per pupil amount as a school with 10,000. The question is, how well are they at moving from 20 to 10? How well are they?
And to do that, they have to lay off teachers and close schools. Right?
Oftentimes, stop hiring new ones. Yeah, lay off teachers, potentially close school in the same way they did on the way up. It's just in the public sector and communities, closing schools is a painful move, and and tends to be hard to do.
Anything to add on that? Next question. Yeah, right there. Mike.
Hi. Cindy Brown from the Center for American Progress. I haven't read Matt's paper, so maybe he addresses this. But you haven't talked much about the relationship of state expenditures to local expenditures. And in some states, a huge burden is put on local districts, and then there's great inequity depending on the tax base and economic conditions of people who live and pay taxes. Has there been any change? Is there any change coming that you see? Maybe this is a question for you. Is it, where is it most prevalent, and have you seen any recent movement?
I'll take this one quickly.
Yep.
And that the state that had that was considered to be the most egregious in this kind of setup was Illinois, and they just passed a new finance formula targeted at mitigating some of these discrepancies and the reliance on local property taxes. How it's implemented remains to be seen, and there's hold harmless provisions that extend for 20 years. So there's progress, and I think it's recognized in state legislatures, and so yeah, Illinois is a good example of states moving forward on it. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that, but
Can I add one thought, which is if you look over the last several decades, there's more, school districts are funded by mostly state and local money. And the push has been go more towards state money because it was more equitable. Of course, the recession, state didn't have money, so they started relying on more local. The problem is that there's a fundamental trade-off, I think, between how much money you have and how equitable it is. And the root cause of that issue is that taxpayers are more likely to vote yes on a local initiative than they are likely to vote yes for more state taxes.
Right.
So they will do in the very same election, they'll say, oh yeah, I'll definitely vote more for my local levy, and no way on that state initiative, I don't trust those people down at the Capitol. Right. And even if the money is still for schools, it might come back to their schools. So with that tension, we have this thing. So we can say we'll cap local money, and we'll close that spigot, and we're just going to fund schools more equitably with state money. And then what you end up having is a state, even like Idaho, which did that, where your average spending is around $8,000 or something per student, well underneath the national mean, because you don't have access to those local revenues. As soon as you open that local spigot, then you're often tolerating some sort of level of inequity, particularly if your state doesn't do a very good job of sort of taking the state money and using it to level up. And I think that's the fundamental tension that we have with a lot of these state plans, is how much money and how equitable, and trying to find the fine line there has proven difficult for many states.
And maybe just one additional thing on top of all of that is that I think Marguerite is absolutely right. And there are some states that, even though they have a relatively small share of their overall budget coming from the state, which you would think would be likely to lead to a more regressive spending, that's not always true. Like we know that there are some places where they have a fairly low percentage of state money in the total bucket, but they've done a better job of targeting that money, and so that really can still make a big difference for their highest need districts. So it is a trade-off, but you can design a policy where you are better at targeting what small amount of state money you have to be more equitable.
Well, one pressure on the equity and adequacy piece that we haven't talked about much is the role of courts, which really have driven a lot of changes in states. Dan, do you think you could speak to what's happening now and what you're seeing in different states in the role of school funding litigation?
Sure. We were talking before this began a little bit about this, and my current interest is, since the Great Recession, have courts been more or less willing to find the school finance systems in states unconstitutional,
right,
either for lack of dollars or for a lack of equity in the system. So I'm going to look at that tomorrow. I'm going to figure out what that is. But What we have seen is states where the courts have decided to step into the political thicket on this question have been bogged down in years and years of trying to get legislatures to enact what they deem as an equitable or adequate system. And these constitutional standards are kind of all over the place from state to state. There's not one standard that courts use. And Washington is such a great example of this because the court there fined the legislature $100,000 every day that it does not enact a constitutional
Washington
system.
State. I think.
Washington
Yes.
State, yeah, Washington State. And so the legislature, they have pay $100,000 every day into a fund. It goes back and feeds into I don't know if it feeds back into the general fund or what, but one thing it can do, though, these cases can be the instigator for making these differences in terms of equity. And oftentimes the outcome of these cases is that states will direct more resources to districts where there's concentrations of poverty, of students in poverty. And then that's where we get the research, the Carabo-Jackson research and whatnot.
Right.
I mean, Ari, can you speak to what extent you see courts as a solution, if at all, to the political problems? Can courts come in and help solve the political problems, or do they just run into the exact same pressures that the legislatures do in terms of solving school funding?
So I thought about this a lot, like, I don't know, however many years ago it was that I was in grad school, because I went to a public policy school and to law school, and I knew I wanted to work on this issue, and I thought a lot about, like, what is a more effective way to tackle it. And I don't know if anyone's ever read the book Hollow Hope. It's basically making the case that courts don't matter in social reform. It's very depressing. So it's very depressing. Read it if you want to get depressed. So I think that the answer is that, much like does money matter, I kind of take issue with the question. Like, courts can help, and so in some places courts and litigation have helped, and that's why you see the research that the Carabo-Jackson and Rucker-Johnson research showing that, like, in some places courts have led to real meaningful increases in spending that have been long-term. Unlike a lot of policy initiatives that are short-term infusions of cash, court-mandated changes have often led to increases that have sort of lasted, even if they're small. So in that way, I mean, yes, they have helped. I think you've also seen in a lot of cases courts say this is bad, and then they turn it over to the legislature to fix it, and then we're back in the exact same boat, and legislatures can't just act because the court told them to. I mean, we've seen that in Washington. So I don't know. I feel like it's I don't know. It's a little bit helpful in overcoming politics.
All right, let's head back to questions. Other questions? Right over there.
Two questions. One
Let's
is
just
that
do one.
the-
Let's just
all
do
right.
one question.
All right.
I let him cheat, but try to stick with
The
one.
question is, for states like New Jersey, who have done under court order quite a substantial compensation for unequal spending and more to low-income schools, do they get better having been in there for some time, do they get better results?
Well, the research you just talked about speaks to that
Well, it didn't speak
directly.
to New Jersey
Yes, but
specifically,
in
and
general.
I think the research might not be great in the Abbott school districts, although I cannot remember that off the top of my head. But I think the research that we have seen broadly, like when researchers just out of Berkeley in 2016 and 2017 published papers that looked at exactly this question over increases in spending that came from litigation and how did that impact outcomes, and it actually does show statistically significant increases in graduation rates and years of schooling completed. Now, they're not huge, like to Marguerite's earlier point, they're not solving all problems, but they are real.
And I think one theory might have been that court-ordered spending would be less effective at actually improving outcomes than legislative spending. But
But it
those
turned out to
recent
not.
studies, we haven't seen any evidence of that. Next question. Matt, make sure to introduce yourself.
In your school.
The other Matt. How much do you think we should care about the level of spending, especially in high needs districts, versus the distribution of spending? Like if a state is spending at guaranteeing a high level, every district's getting X thousand dollars per kid at least, and we think that that's enough defined in some way. Should we care if wealthy districts are off raising property taxes and building swimming pools and doing God knows what and spending more?
And this is like what is in New York State, where they spend a ton per pupil, like 20,000, but there is some evidence of inequities.
So I think the right way to answer that question is with another question, which is how are the kids doing in the schools that are getting less, and are they graduating at lower rates? Are they achieving at lower rates? And if so, then I think we should care about that, and I think we should think about redistribution and increasing. I mean, I think we all care about this not for the sake of money, but for the sake of kids learning and kids graduating. So I guess it's maybe not a fair thing to answer a question with a question, but I think we should care to the extent that there are still achievement gaps in New York.
Sure.
So I think, can I jump in?
You can.
I think that it's a really, this is like the critical question for a legislature. So would the answer in New York be to say, we're going to tell Scarsdale, doesn't really get any, they don't get any federal money. I don't think they barely get any state money. They raise it all locally. That we're going to cap your money. And in doing so, you take a whole bunch of districts like that, and they get angry enough that they then also, as a voting group, limit the amount of money for the state. And in capping their money, you now may have to give them some of the state money. And now all of your district spending has come down a little bit, or at least, so if you look at it in New York, there's that kind of a minimum threshold. And then there's some of these districts that can spend just gobs more money, right? Like just a lot more money. And should we push that down, but then we may end up politically with lower spending across all the districts? Or should we let that go up because we're getting extra cash that we can get?
So what should we do?
And I think yes, I think that's a really a fundamental issue. I'm not sure in many states, based on our constitution, that you can go tell them off, but tell them you can't spend your money, can't spend your local money in that point. And I'm not 100% sure that the excessive money in some places is really at the detriment of low-income kids in other school districts. So they have this fancy hockey team, like that.
But
that's
aren't
the kind
they
of stuff.
competing for the same talent pool of teachers?
and
in New York City, I don't know the empirics of this, but this is a recurring concern anecdotally that you see teachers leaving for the suburbs for higher pay and potentially even better working conditions.
And that is, and I think that's where you find the balance, right? That is the line that you draw the balance. And I do know from the Chicago area districts that is real. I mean, the teachers were making double the salary by going 6 miles outside the city. And there's no way that
for an easier job too.
For an easier job where all the kids are in private tutoring or something like that. And so if you think about that kind of effect, then it is really real. If you're Colorado or something and way over in the corner there's like Aspen and no one else can get in and out of there and they spend more, maybe you just say, fine, I don't care. So I do think that's the balance. But in the name of equity, if we lower spending so far down that the rest of the districts are suffering, I'm not sure that I would do that deal.
I agree, except I also would say that if we look historically, the way to make change is to get everybody in it sort of together, right? And so like if the families in Scarsdale have no problems right now because they can just keep raising as much money as they want, they're never going to care about like funding for public education across New York, right? Because it doesn't matter to them, they're fine. So I think there is something to be said for like, I know it doesn't actually hurt all the other students that Scarsdale kids have more, but it is true that like, as long as they are powerful and comfortable in Scarsdale, status quo is hard to change.
Next question.
Yeah, it's the balance.
Oh, sorry.
It's
Yeah,
hard-
One little anecdote.
Yeah.
One of my favorite sayings from a state legislator, he was quoted in the press, so I don't have to ask him if I can read. But this is a very conservative legislator from Utah. He's the head of the Utah Taxpayers Foundation. But he was quoted in the press as saying, Utah, we have a socialized system for funding schools. And Utah does have one of the more equitable funding systems in the nation. And he is adamant
AKA
about
socialized.
it. Yes, AKA socialized. Yeah, but he's adamant about it. And he gets really angry when there's bills that come forward that would change the property tax structure. And so it's just interesting, as an anecdote from the state that's the lowest spending, except for maybe Idaho.
It's
It
in
goes
the
back and
bottom.
forth.
It's in that bottom.
Yeah.
Those the five at the bottom, like
Yeah.
fight to the
Competition
bottom,
with
I guess.
Oklahoma.
But what money they do have, they've been really successful at targeting the inequities.
Next question. Yep, right here.
Hi, my name's Meredith Palm. I actually just moved to DC, so I don't currently work anywhere.
You're independent.
Yeah, I am, exactly. But I'm a former Teach for America core member, so I'm interested in education policy, which is why I'm here. My big question is, and it may be too much in the weeds and not really what you guys handle, but my big question is, obviously we know that we want to have money going towards where the inequities are, right, towards the higher needs schools. But we're also talking about the idea that we're spending more to get worse outcomes than a lot of other countries. So my question is, when the money goes to those schools, do you guys have any opinions or from the research of where would you, ideally, if you were looking at their budget, what programs and services would a lot of those dollars be allocated towards to get the most outcome for each dollar spent?
So that's a big question, how to spend money better, and we have some opinions. Go ahead, Marguerite.
Well, I would say that what works in one school might be something different than works in another school. And our research really shows that sometimes what you'll say is generally what matters most is X, Y, and Z. When you go tell another school to spend their money on X, Y, and Z, they don't get the same effect, which is a really big problem in school finance. In fact, it is a really frustrating finding if you spent 20 years of researching this and you thought the answer was in there somewhere, and I just don't want to tell you my life story, but that was a really, really frustrating finding that, we've looked and looked and looked and sort of tried to kind of come up with these answers. And when you do find an effect, the effect is still really small.
Can I interject for a sec, Marguerite, and ask you, what do you think about the research on high-intensity tutoring for kids who are struggling in math? And there seems to be some studies that have come out showing that, yes, that's expensive to give students one-on-two tutoring, 2 students, 1 teacher, but you get a really big return on that investment.
Yeah. So the question is compared to what else, right? So a lot of these studies have said, if you spend more money on X, do you get a better outcome? You spend more money on this tutoring, you get a better outcome. What if you spent that money on something else instead?
But these effects are bigger than, almost
yes,
anything
well, they're really,
we've
really
seen.
expensive, right? So if you spent all that money on making schooling 50 weeks a year and making it 8 hours a day and giving low-income families money so they weren't so stressed out at home.
Right.
And these are the kinds of trade-offs of things you could do.
Sure.
Paying teachers double the amount so they were competing with people in the tech space. You might have really different teachers for that. So we don't know, right? And that question, we have to consider that if you're going to spend the money on some one thing. What else could you have spent on it? Could you gotten a bigger effect? And I think, plus we don't have that money for everybody. We just don't have it. I don't think there's any state that has that much money that could spend it on all of that thing. Where we've looked a lot across the data, we look at we call them ROI superstars, schools that spend about the average or less and beat the odds for the kids they have. The one thing that's really upsetting is that schools don't know if they're an ROI superstar because we're not doing a very good job of measuring spending and outcomes at the school, but we will, so that's coming. But among ROI superstars, we did a study looking at what's the secret sauce of these ROI superstars, and they're all doing really different things. The one consistent pattern is they were 100% committed to leveraging their resources to getting the greatest outcome possible. And that is something that we haven't sort of asked principals and school leaders and even districts to really focus on, is getting the greatest outcome possible with the dollars that you have. And I think that if we could sort of train people up on that's the goal, that you would find a different outcome. And I'll just say that we're launching a new finance certificate at Georgetown that will start in this winter for different cohorts to really kind of focus on that issue up and
And you'll
down
tell
and
them you
across
don't
the
know
system.
what works. So
No, we'll say that focusing on getting the best outcome with the dollars you have is what works.
Right.
So
Can I just add
Yeah,
one quick?
and
So,
Dan.
Sorry, Dan, go. I've been talking.
Well,
You go
okay, I'll
first.
say really
I won't
quickly.
talk.
I was just going to say, since this is about state finance policy, that one trend that we've seen at the state level is to be less prescriptive and particularly with categorical aid. So we've had categorical programs. California's was the shining example of this, with hundreds of, over 100 categorical programs for specific, requiring specific expenditures on specific programs and whatnot. But the trend is to move away from that and to give districts the flexibility to figure out what's working at the more localized level. But that comes with a trade-off of accountability. And so the states are relaxing the spending requirements, but looking for ways to hold the districts accountable. And I don't think we've really figured that out yet. California certainly hasn't figured that out.
And EdTrust has done the California chapter has done some work on that, suggesting that the money is not necessarily getting to the disadvantaged kids in California.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's right, and that's actually not what I was going to say, but that's right. Good work. I think one additional just thought to complicate this is that we look at these like dispelling the myth schools and try to figure out what's their secret sauce and kind of come up with the same thing of like there's not a single secret sauce. But I do think one thing that is common across a lot of districts is that even if they are led by people who are really focused on leveraging their dollars and trying to figure out how to do it, they're often constrained by a lot of requirements and a lot of constraints. That's not very articulate of me. And I think one of the things that matters a lot is figuring out how to give district leaders who want to do the right thing and do new innovative things the ability to do that. And right now, if they get increased funding, oftentimes what they do because of politics or because of existing rules is they do like an across the board, very small increase in teacher salaries. And I love teachers, and I think teachers should be getting paid a whole lot more than they're getting paid, but very minor, but very.
Ooh, we got some applause. Yep, one person.
Like I think that if I had a whole lot of money, that's what I would do with it. But very small increases in salary spread very thinly across the pool to everybody is not going to change outcomes for kids. And so it's unfortunate that a lot of times when you do get increases, you don't go through the process of really strategically thinking about how could we most leverage this money for our highest need kids. And that's because of politics and because of strings from states and strings from districts. So figuring out how to encourage that.
Other questions? Yeah, right there.
Hi, I'm Emily and I work at the Progressive Policy Institute. And I'm really interested in public charter schools, and I know that they don't perform well everywhere, but places where they do perform well, like the district, they still receive unequal funding per student. There was recently a lawsuit on it, even when they have similar demographics to their neighborhood schools, and arguably maybe perform better, and they don't get district buildings, so they have extra expenses. Is there a way we can address those inequalities when those schools are doing well?
Can someone speak to that and also talk about the premise of the question? Because I have seen reports on this, but I've also found this an extremely complicated area because oftentimes you see the districts are paying for things that the charter schools are doing, like the special education or the transportation. So it seems really, really hard to get these apples to apples comparisons. Love thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a state by state game. So there are states you can show that the charters are getting an equal amount of dollars, and there are states where they're not because the policies are different in different states. And I think making sure we know sort of what we're spending, but this similar complication of like in states like Maryland and Tennessee, the money kind of goes to the district. The district provides some services, and then it goes to the charter. And there's a kind of sense of how do we account for the money that the district spent so that it's not layered on top of the district students and then used in that sort of apples to apples, in an apples to oranges comparison. So that's a particular issue. Fighting for, the equal dollars to go to charters brings up that exact same issue we were talking before with, well, if there's a limited amount of money, that's going to come out of the districts. Districts have a hard time shrinking if more students are going to the charters, and you could see how the arguments begin.
And charters in state capitals were oftentimes sold as a way to find out what works at more economically too. So I've heard it argued that charters, that the point is that they can function with less dollars, and that they're trying to be innovative with their funds to increase student achievement at a more economical rate.
So we only have a couple minutes left. I would just want to put one last question to the panel myself, which is, if we have folks from state legislators watching us on the live stream, Capitol, or in our audience, Capital City, and they're like, okay, so what do I do? I heard all you guys talk about how difficult everything is and how we're not really sure what to do and it's complicated. If you were giving advice to a state legislature, if you were thinking like, if states just did X, things would improve a lot. And I know there's not one thing, there's not one silver bullet, but what is the X? What is the one piece of advice that you would give to states to try to help them improve their school funding system in some way? So I won't start with you, Ari. I'll start with Dan, if you need a second to think of it.
Oh, yeah, I know. This is
It's
what
a
I
big
do every
question.
single day.
Okay, good.
so
that's
it's
why, why we chose you guys.
Yeah, we could, yeah. I would say come participate in this really great school finance fellowship that we have. Thanks to the Learning Policy Institute that we've partnered with, and we have about 20 legislators who are school finance leaders in their states that we're bringing together and
that's going to fix their school funding
and
system.
But we hope that
Single-handedly.
because what we see in legislatures, there's usually just one or two legislators who know the school finance system,
right?
And all the other legislators look to that person as to how to vote on a particular bill, oftentimes. So we believe that educating as many legislators as we can about just the fundamentals of school finance and then also the struggles that each state, we hope that the research can help alleviate that the education is, we're in education, but educating legislators is
Gotcha.
key. So
Cool. Marguerite?
Well, so states do ask this a lot of times, and I don't think that the shortage is of the idea or what to do. I think that the window opens only about every 2, maybe 3 decades in a state to do major finance reform. So I'd say if you're in the window, get it right, because that thing is going to close and you're going to be in 2030 something before this window opens again. So I would say that's the issue. Most of them are not in that window, unfortunately. So I would say, and this is probably going to be not what you expected, I would say make your school board members do some training on finance. And that's because, yes, the state can get the money to the district. And then these districts have these mega budgets, sometimes in the billions of dollars, and they are just elected, and the school board sits down, and guess what their job is? Their job primarily is to decide how all the public expenditures in our country are spent. So the $600 billion we have, it's the school board members who decide how to spend that money. And when I have a room full of school board members and I say, who decides how to spend the money in public education? They look around and they go, well, it's not us. And I'm like, no, it is you. It's you. You're the ones who decide that. Remember that meeting where you took the budget and you signed your name on it? You decided how to spend all the money in public education. So if you were to ask me really, what is the one thing that would be a game changer for students, it would be to do training for this group so they don't even know that they're spending more in some of their schools than others. They don't even know that when they do like an across-the-board salary raise, it costs this much money, and that was instead of doing tutoring or something else like that. They don't really have a sense of that. They think they're there because they got elected because I had to save one school or change the vendor for the pizza or whatever it is. So I think school board member training would be really the one game changer.
All right, last word for you, Ari. No pressure.
I would say one is what I thought Marguerite was going to say, so now I have to say 2 things. I'm sorry, I was so sure she was going to say it. I think you have to be, state level is where you have the ability to create good data, and you've got to do it. So you've got to own that. It's not sexy, but that's how we figure out what's going on. So you have to collect and report data well and in a way that researchers can access and parents can understand. And then 2, you have to own your state funding formulas and mechanisms. And you have to take responsibility for looking to say, what do I think it is supposed to do? It's really complicated, and I need to figure out what I think its values are, what I think my values are, and whether the policy is getting there, and then is supposed to be getting there. And then you have to compare that to the data and say, is it actually working? And if not, why? And like really take the hard time to dig into figuring out why you think, like Maryland has a funding formula that says they weight students of poverty at like twice as much as everyone else. But then when you actually look at their data, they're like one of the more regressive in the country. And their weight is the most progressive in the country. So like it is incumbent upon people at the state level in Maryland to be figuring out why is that, and then to try to figure out how to close it. So I think really owning the things that you do have control over and taking responsibility for figuring out if they're working and if not, why.
Great.
Can I add one more?
Yes.
Quickly? I don't know if we have time. But
Last word.
the other piece of advice I often give is that when thinking about restructuring your school finance formula, don't do it within the context of rethinking your whole education system. And that sounds really big and lofty, but NCSL put out a report about where the legislators went and looked at the best top performing countries and taking the lessons from the top performing countries. It's called No Time to Lose. And a few states, because you brought Maryland, I'm going to bring up Maryland, took that report and they're looking at their whole approach to delivering education in their state. But they're also doing it at the same time they're looking at their school funding formula. So these things should be done together. When you're taking these big approaches, these big commissions, statewide commissions at looking at education, that you should do it in conjunction with looking at your school funding formula as well, so that they're rational. They're rationally aligned.
Gotcha. Well, thanks for great questions from the audience. Thanks for a great panel and lively discussion. Appreciate it.
Just on behalf of Urban, wanted to thank our moderator and panelists once again. So thank you, and thank you all for coming.